The alien fleet was massive, a dark sea of starships, each one more advanced than anything humanity had ever seen. Their captain, a towering figure of confidence and intellect, stood at the command center, watching the Earth below through a vast holographic window. His name was Talter, and he was known across the galaxy as one of the greatest tacticians of his people. With his sharp mind, he had crushed countless civilizations, bending them to his will. But today, as his fleet prepared to invade Earth, Talter couldn't hide his amusement. The humans had no idea what they were up against. They believe they can stop us. Talter muttered with a chuckle, his deep voice rumbling through the command center. Such arrogance. They've seen the power of our fleet, but they still dare to fight. His alien officers, standing at attention, glanced nervously at each other, but none dared to challenge their leader's words. Talter had earned his reputation, after all. No one had ever defeated him. Not once. He turned to his lieutenant, a tall, thin alien with long, flowing silver tendrils that hung around his face like curtains. What do they have, Zychron? What are their strategies? Zychron's voice was cool, almost as if he was speaking of a child's play. The humans have gathered their forces, sir. They've placed ships and satellites in orbit around their planet. Their strategy seems to rely on sheer numbers and confusion. They believe their unpredictability can throw us off balance. Talter smirked. Is that their plan? Chaos. He leaned back in his chair, a burst of laughter escaping his lips. How quaint. Chaos is nothing but noise. We are the symphony. They are the background hum. He turned his gaze back to the holographic map, a complex display of ships, orbital stations, and human defense structures surrounding the Earth. The humans had managed to muster a fleet, but Talter knew it was nothing compared to his own. Their ships were primitive, clunky, and underpowered. Even their most advanced technologies, those that could match a fraction of his fleet's firepower, were far from a match. Activate the comms, Talter ordered. His eyes glinted with the thrill of anticipation. It was almost too easy. He opened a channel to the human command center on Earth, knowing their leaders would be watching. The human general appeared on the screen, a tough-looking woman with short-cropped hair and a piercing gaze. She didn't flinch when she saw Talter's face, nor did she bow to his superior presence. Instead, she stood tall, confident. "This is General Sophia Williams," she said with a voice that held a touch of defiance. "What do you want, alien?" Talter could not help but grin at her response. They truly had no idea. "You're foolish to think you can defend your planet from us, General," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle. "Your technology is outdated. Your ships are slow. You are nothing compared to the might of our fleet. Your people will bow before us, or they will perish." Sophia didn't blink. "We're not afraid of you," she replied simply. "We're not going to surrender, and we won't let you take Earth without a fight." Talter laughed again, a deep, resonating sound that filled the room. "Oh, I do love a good challenge," he said, shaking his head. "But understand this. You've already lost. The battle is decided before it even begins." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in. "You can resist, of course, but resistance is futile." Without waiting for a response, he cut the transmission. The laugh he had held inside burst out again as he stood, pacing in front of the holographic window. The humans thought they had a chance. They thought their bravery and will could stand against the unstoppable force of his people. But Talter knew better. Their forces were scattered, uncoordinated. They lacked unity, strategy, and experience. Their ships were fragile, their technology a far cry from the sleek, powerful vessels that made up his fleet. And their tactics, a laughable mockery of real warfare. He had studied their strategies. Primitive formations, confusing maneuvers meant to create disorder. It was no match for his calculated genius. The fleet's first wave was already moving toward Earth. The alien ships drifted like shadows, their engines humming softly as they entered the outer reaches of the planet's defenses. Talter didn't need to give orders. His fleet was an extension of his own mind. Every ship, every gun, every missile was programmed to follow his will to the letter. He had planned this attack down to the smallest detail, and when the humans attempted to launch their own offensive, it would be like trying to stop a river with a dam made of sand. The first human vessels appeared on the radar, tiny dots of light that grew larger with every passing second. They had underestimated the enemy, sending ships into the path of the alien fleet like children playing a game. Talter's officers watched intently as the humans charged forward, some launching desperate strikes with their guns, others trying to dodge the incoming fire. But it was all futile. It was predictable. It was weak. "Fire," Talter ordered calmly, his hand moving with the grace of a conductor directing an orchestra. His fleet unleashed a devastating barrage of plasma and laser fire. The human ships erupted in bright flashes of light as they were torn apart. One by one, they fell, like fragile toys crushed beneath the boot of a giant. Talter watched with amusement as the humans scattered. He could see them trying to regroup, attempting to form a defensive line. But it was clear, their strategy was nothing more than chaos. Their formations were all wrong. They lacked cohesion. It was as if they had simply thrown their ships into space without a second thought. Such primitive thinking, Talter muttered, shaking his head. How could they ever think this would work? He watched as more human ships tried to engage, their weapons ineffective against the alien shields. They seemed to be desperately trying to find some way to outmaneuver the aliens, but their ships were too slow, too clumsy. Every attack they launched was easily deflected. The alien fleet, however, danced around them, cutting through the human defenses like a blade through paper. "Commander Talter," a voice broke his thoughts. He turned to see his lieutenant, Zychron, standing beside him, his expression unreadable. "There's something strange. They're not retreating. They're pushing forward." Talter's grin widened. "Let them," he said, watching the humans' futile attempts. "Let them waste their energy. The outcome is already decided. This will be a short, one-sided war." But even as Talter spoke those words, a small, unexpected shift occurred. A group of human ships, not much more than a handful, seemed to move in unison. Talter's eyes narrowed. They were coordinating. The humans were beginning to use tactics, albeit rudimentary. But it was far too late. Their forces were already in disarray. It would take more than a few clever moves to change the tide. Talter leaned back in his chair, confident that victory was already in his grasp. The humans had no chance. After all, how could they? How could a species that had never seen true interstellar war ever hope to defeat a force as powerful as his own? But as the battle raged on, something began to gnaw at Talter's mind. Though the humans were still failing, their strategy wasn't entirely random. Their persistence was irritating, and something about their tactics, though simple, felt different. But no, he shook the thought away. It was nothing. The humans were outmatched. They would fall, just as every other species had before them. And yet, despite his belief in their inevitable defeat, a small, unfamiliar feeling began to take root in the back of Talter's mind. A feeling he couldn't quite shake. What if they weren't as weak as he thought? What if the humans weren't as predictable as he assumed? But no, that was impossible. He was Talter, the greatest tactician in the galaxy. There was no way the humans could surprise him. Or so he thought. The battle had been raging for hours, yet Talter remained certain of one thing. The humans were no match for his fleet. His ships, sleek and powerful, moved like a well-oiled machine, cutting through the human forces with effortless precision. Every strike was calculated, every maneuver executed flawlessly. The humans had barely dented his forces, and it was only a matter of time before their entire defense crumbled. Talter stood at the helm of his command center, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes focused on the chaotic scene unfolding before him. Human ships, some of them barely more than rusted scraps of metal, tried in vain to hold their ground. Their weapons, primitive and underpowered, failed to pierce the energy shields of his fleet. The human strategy of massing their forces in one place, hoping to overwhelm his ships with numbers, was laughable. They were far too slow, far too predictable. Yet, even as the human fleet scattered before him, something strange caught his attention. A small group of human ships, their designs barely worthy of notice, had managed to regroup, forming an unexpected formation that seemed deliberate. It wasn't much, just a few dozen ships, but they were coordinating their movements with surprising efficiency. Talter's eyes narrowed as he studied them. "What is this?" he muttered, leaning forward in his chair. His lieutenant, Zychron, who had been watching the same display, spoke up. "They're adapting, Commander," Zychron said, his voice tinged with a hint of uncertainty. "They've changed their tactics. It's not just chaos anymore." Talter scoffed. "Adapting. They're simply throwing themselves into a new, more feudal arrangement. It won't change the outcome." But something in Talter's mind nagged at him. The humans weren't retreating. They weren't panicking. They were fighting back, and their formation, though still far too disorganized to pose a real threat, was different. There was a quiet sense of unity among them, something he hadn't expected from such an inferior species. "Get me their communication feed," Talter ordered. "I want to hear their strategy firsthand." Zychron nodded and activated the connection. Within seconds, a transmission from the human general, Sophia Williams, appeared on the screen. She stood resolutely at the helm of one of the last remaining human warships, her face set in grim determination. "This is General Sophia Williams," she said, her voice clear despite the battle raging in the background. "You can destroy our ships, but you won't break our spirit. Earth will not fall without a fight." Talter's smirk deepened. Such determination. It's almost cute. He turned to Zychron, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "Do they really believe their willpower will save them?" Sophia's voice came through again, unwavering. "We may not have your advanced technology, but we have something you don't. We have heart, we have unity, and we will fight for our home. You'll learn that the hard way." Talter's amusement faltered for a brief moment. Her words were defiant, but he knew they were ultimately meaningless. The humans were playing a game they didn't understand, and their strength, though admirable, was irrelevant in the face of his overwhelming power. He dismissed the transmission with a flick of his hand. Let them cling to their hope. It won't matter in the end. But as the seconds passed, the unsettling feeling inside Talter grew. His eyes returned to the holographic display, where the human ships were now moving with greater purpose. Their formation, though far from perfect, was holding together. And as much as Talter wanted to ignore it, something in his gut told him that these humans were not as predictable as he had once believed. The alien fleet's advanced weapons fired again, sending a volley of plasma blasts toward the human ships. The human fleet scattered, but instead of panicking, they regrouped even faster than before, working in coordinated pairs to evade and retaliate. It was chaotic, yet there was a pattern that had not existed earlier. The humans were learning, adapting, and quickly. Talter frowned. He had seen many species in his time, and none had ever adapted so swiftly in the heat of battle. They should have been easy prey. But now, they were becoming a more formidable challenge. "Report," Talter barked, turning toward his officers. "What's happening to their fleet?" One of his officers, a young alien named Halson, studied the data before responding. "Their ships are still inferior, Commander, but they've modified their tactics. They're using hit-and-run strategies now, small, fast attacks followed by quick retreats. They're exploiting the gaps in our defenses. It's effective." Talter stood silent for a moment, digesting the information. He had underestimated them. It was clear now. The humans weren't just throwing themselves at his fleet like mindless animals. They were learning. They were adapting. And worse yet, they were doing it faster than he had anticipated. "Impossible," Talter muttered. "This can't be happening." How are they learning this quickly? Zycran approached cautiously. Maybe their strategy isn't just based on logic. Maybe there's something else. Something we don't understand. Talter clenched his fists in frustration. The humans were frustratingly unpredictable, and it made them far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. They weren't playing by the rules he knew, the rules that had led to his countless victories. The very notion that they could adjust so quickly, so effectively, threw him off balance. "I want more information," he ordered, his voice low with growing anger. "Do not underestimate them. I will not let a weak species like this best me." As his officers scrambled to provide more data, Talter's thoughts raced. This wasn't just about battle tactics anymore. It was about something deeper, something primal in the human psyche that he couldn't quite grasp. He had studied them, watched them, dissected their weaknesses, and yet they were doing something he hadn't expected. They were evolving in real time, adapting to every strike, learning from their mistakes. The realization hit Talter like a bolt of lightning. He was not facing an inferior species. He was facing a species that had the potential to outthink and outfight even the most advanced minds in the galaxy. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for something more. "Commander Talter," Zycran said, his voice urgent. "Their fleet is splitting. They're forming smaller groups, creating pockets of resistance that we can't easily target." Talter's eyes narrowed, his confidence slipping as the human's adaptability became clearer. He had spent years honing his skills as the greatest tactician in the galaxy, but this was something entirely new. The humans were unpredictable, and that was something Talter had never accounted for. "What is this?" Talter whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "What is it that drives them to learn like this?" His mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. The humans had been under his radar, a species he believed to be unworthy of his attention. But now, they were showing him that they had something more, something he had never expected, something that would make them far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. And it was this very realization that would soon turn the tide of battle. Talter, the greatest tactician in the galaxy, had made a grave mistake. He had underestimated humanity. The battle raged on, but Talter could no longer deny the unsettling truth. His fleet, once invincible in his eyes, was beginning to buckle under the relentless pressure of the humans. Their tactics had shifted from desperate survival to calculated aggression. Their ships, though weak and poorly equipped in comparison, moved with a surprising efficiency, exploiting the weaknesses in Talter's once perfect strategy. Talter's gaze remained fixed on the holographic display in front of him, watching as his fleet's ships, once unchallenged, were now under attack from all sides. The human formations, though still scattered, were beginning to form pockets of resistance that were difficult to break. Small groups of human vessels would dart in, strike hard, and then vanish into the chaos, only to reappear elsewhere, striking again. It was as if they were mocking him, playing a game he hadn't agreed to. "How are they doing this?" Talter muttered under his breath, his usual confidence starting to crack. He had studied human tactics for years before the battle, but this was beyond anything he had prepared for. These humans weren't just warriors. They were innovators, and they were using their weaknesses as strength. The lights of the command center flickered as another explosion rocked the ship. Talter turned sharply to face Zycran, his lieutenant, who was looking at the screens with a growing sense of concern. "We've lost another ship, Commander," Zycran reported, his voice tense. It wasn't even in the most vulnerable part of the formation. "How are they?" "I know, Zycran," Talter interrupted, his voice tight. "Their unpredictability is their strength." He clenched his fists, watching the chaotic movements of the humans. "They're no longer just running," Zycran said, still astonished. "They're coordinating. This isn't desperation, it's precision." Talter looked down at the tactical map, a sense of unease creeping up his spine. It wasn't just that the humans were fighting harder. It was that they were learning. Their strategy was shifting at an alarming rate. What was once a primitive defensive posture had morphed into something more dangerous, something more calculated. "They're not just adapting, Commander," Zykryn said cautiously. "They're evolving mid-battle. Their reactions, their decisions, they're beyond what we expected." Talter stood still for a moment, taking in the chaotic symphony of the battlefield. He had spent his entire career being the one who controlled the battlefield, the one who dictated the terms of engagement. And now, here he was, watching his perfect plan crumble at the hands of the very species he had dismissed as unworthy. "They're improvising," Talter muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "How can they be doing this so quickly?" Zykryn didn't respond immediately, his eyes glued to the screen. The humans were relentless. The ships that remained weren't retreating or surrendering. They were pushing forward, exploiting every vulnerability, every small gap in Talter's defenses. "They found a way to exploit us," Zykryn finally said. "We've underestimated them." Talter's mind raced as he scanned the battlefield once more. It was true. The humans were playing a game of attrition, and every time Talter thought he had them cornered, they would slip away, finding an opening in his fleet. Their desperation had turned into determination. The sheer tenacity of the human spirit was becoming a weapon, and it was something that Talter had never considered. He was beginning to understand. He had been so focused on their flaws, on the weaknesses of their ships and their technology, that he had failed to see the most dangerous thing about the humans. Their resolve, their will to adapt. Talter's mind flashed back to the transmission from General Sophia Williams. Her defiance. The words that had sounded so insignificant before. Now they rang in his ears like an alarm bell. "Earth will not fall without a fight." His lips curled into a sneer, but it was no longer filled with the confidence he had once held. There was something else behind it now, something like frustration. He had been so sure that the humans would break under his overwhelming force. But they weren't breaking. They were fighting harder, smarter. "Get me a status report on the remaining ships," Talter ordered, his voice cold and hard. "I want to know exactly what we're facing." One of the officers on the command deck quickly processed the data, then turned to Talter. "Commander, the humans still have nearly 40 ships left. They're in smaller groups now, but they're still coordinated. Their tactics, they're evolving by the minute." Talter's eyes narrowed. 40 ships. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to keep his fleet occupied. And that was something Talter could not afford. He had always prided himself on keeping his enemies on the defensive, making sure they could never regroup or retaliate. But the humans weren't allowing that to happen. They were staying in the fight, shifting tactics, and making every move with purpose. "Fine," Talter said, his voice hardening. "Then we'll give them a fight they won't forget." He turned to Zykryn. "Initiate Phase 2. We'll tighten the formation and push forward. We'll use the weight of our firepower to crush them." Zykryn hesitated for a moment before nodding. "As you wish, Commander." Talter paced back and forth, waiting for his orders to be carried out. His eyes were fixed on the holographic display, watching as his fleet began to move into a more concentrated formation, closing the gaps and increasing the pressure on the human ships. He would end this now. There was no way they could keep up with the sheer force of his firepower. But even as the orders were given, something gnawed at the back of his mind. He had underestimated them before. And now, as his fleet moved in on the humans, he had to ask himself, would he make the same mistake again? Talter's hands tightened into fists. His ego had been bruised. His arrogance had led him to dismiss the humans as insignificant, as beneath him. But now, their resilience was forcing him to take them seriously. And that was a mistake he could not afford to make again. As the battle continued to rage, Talter steeled himself. He would crush them, no matter what. The humans would be nothing but ashes by the end of the day. But even in his thoughts, a tiny voice whispered, what if they had already won in ways you couldn't understand? And that was a question Talter would soon have to answer in the only way that mattered, through the fire and fury of the battlefield. Talter's fleet had shifted into a more aggressive formation, the pressure mounting as the human ships kept darting in and out of the chaos. He had hoped that his concentrated firepower would be the final blow, but the humans refused to yield. Their strategy had become unpredictable, fluid. Talter was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. The battle had already taken a turn for the worse. His fleet's command ships, once positioned at the center of the formation, were now vulnerable, each one a prime target for the elusive human vessels. Each time one of his ships tried to break off to engage the humans, it was met with overwhelming force, their tactics utterly alien to Talter's previous experience. And yet, despite his fleet's superior firepower, despite everything, the humans were surviving. "Commander, we have a problem." Zekran's voice broke through his thoughts. Talter turned sharply, his gaze snapping to his lieutenant. Zekran's face was tight with anxiety. His eyes locked on the screen showing one of the largest of Talter's command ships, the Zelithar, under heavy fire. "What is it?" Talter asked, his voice a quiet, controlled fury. "The human ships." Zekran hesitated for a moment, as though unwilling to speak the next words. "They're targeting our weak points, Commander. They're finding every gap in our defense." Talter's chest tightened. This was not just an attack. It was an onslaught, an intelligence-driven assault that was beginning to tear his fleet apart from the inside. The Zelithar was one of his most important vessels, a symbol of his power and prestige. And yet, here it was, fighting for its life against a handful of human ships. The audacity of it. It was as if they had known where to strike from the very beginning. Talter's mind raced. There had been reports from his scouts, vague whispers about human adaptability and their ability to learn mid-battle. But this was beyond anything he had expected. It was as if the humans were reading his tactics and countering them with a precision he had never before encountered. "Why aren't we doing more damage to them?" Talter growled. Zekran swallowed, his voice strained. "Their ships are highly mobile, Commander. They don't fight head-on. They slip between our lines, targeting weak spots and retreating before we can retaliate. Then they're just pests," Talter snapped. "That's all they are." But even as he said the words, his confidence faltered. The human ships weren't pests. They weren't retreating, not really. They were pulling back only to regroup, to strike again in a different location, a different pattern. They were wearing him down, one calculated blow at a time. A new report flashed on the command screen. Another one of his ships had been destroyed. The Varvesh, a destroyer, had been completely obliterated in less than an hour, its debris scattered across the battlefield. The human ships had come out of nowhere, striking with laser precision, tearing through the armor of the ship as though it were paper. The Varvesh had never stood a chance. Talter's fists clenched, his claws digging into the armrests of his command chair. This was no longer about tactics, it was personal. The humans were mocking him. Every time he thought he had them, they slipped away, always just out of reach. It felt as though they were toying with him. "How many human ships remain?" he asked, his voice low. Zekran looked at the screen again, the numbers on the report continuing to change. "About 36, Commander. They're not retreating. They're reorganizing." "Reorganizing," Talter repeated incredulously. "They've been fighting for hours. How can they still?" "Look at this," Zekran said, tapping the screen to show a new tactical display. The human ships were now forming groups, small and nimble but increasing in coordination. They were consolidating their numbers into tighter formations, gathering into pockets, and every time they did, their firepower seemed to double. The realization hit Talter like a punch to the chest. "They're preparing for something bigger," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. "They're planning a coordinated attack. They're not fighting to survive anymore. They're fighting to win." Zekran's expression mirrored his. The realization that the humans were shifting from defense to offense was a dangerous one. The tactics that Talter had once so easily mastered were now slipping from his grasp. The human fleet wasn't just responding. They were anticipating. They were adapting to every move he made, countering each assault with a new strategy. Talter's once flawless plan was falling apart before his eyes, and it was no longer a matter of how long his fleet could hold out. It was how long it could survive. The hum of the command center filled the silence for a moment, as Taltor took in the battlefield before him. His fleet was taking heavy casualties. His confidence had cracked under the pressure, and in its place was a gnawing fear that he could no longer ignore. The humans weren't just outsmarting him. They were wearing him down, playing a long game of attrition. Order the fleet to re-engage. Talter finally barked, his voice colder now, harder. Form a tighter perimeter around the remaining command ships. We will force them into submission. Zycran hesitated. Commander, we've already lost 2 more ships. Their attack. I said do it. Talter snapped, his voice cold and unforgiving. Zycran gave a quick nod and relayed the orders, but as the fleet shifted into their new formation, Talter could feel the tension building in the air. His own tactics were starting to feel insufficient, outdated even. The humans had adapted faster than he had anticipated, exploiting the very weaknesses that had once seemed like mere details. Now they were threatening the heart of his fleet. Talter's fingers clenched around the armrests once again. The fear that had once been distant now crept closer, seeping into his thoughts. He had underestimated the humans, and as his fleet struggled to regain control, he knew that he would have to find a way to turn the tide. But how? How could he defeat an enemy that was already one step ahead? That was learning, growing stronger with every passing minute. His mind raced as the sounds of the battlefield raged on. His pride, his reputation, and his fleet were all hanging in the balance. The humans had started as nothing, but now they were threatening to bring everything he had worked for crashing down. It was no longer a question of if they could win. It was a question of how far Talter would allow them to go before he was forced to accept defeat. And in that moment, he realized he wasn't just fighting the humans anymore. He was fighting his own arrogance. Talter's grip tightened around the command chair, his claws digging into the cold metal. His gaze swept across the battlefield, but his mind was elsewhere. The battle was spiraling out of control, and with each passing moment, his confidence eroded further. The humans weren't simply playing a game. They were dismantling him piece by piece. The tactical screens in front of him painted a grim picture. The human ships, though outnumbered, were still alive, still moving, still striking with deadly accuracy. His fleet was beginning to fracture. The once mighty warships that had made him feel invincible were being torn apart by relentless, calculated strikes. Each human vessel, each human pilot, seemed to possess an almost supernatural understanding of how to fight in deep space, and their strategies were unlike anything Talter had ever encountered. Commander, the remaining destroyers are pulling back, Zycran reported, his voice strained, a slight edge of panic creeping in. They're too heavily damaged to continue the assault. Talter's eyes narrowed. He could hear the fear in Zycran's voice, and it only fueled his fury. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had seen human forces before, disorganized, primitive, with no real understanding of true strategy. But now, they were an unstoppable force, and Talter was losing control of his own fleet. Retreat! Talter barked, his voice sharp and commanding, though even to his own ears it felt hollow. Have the remaining ships fall back to formation. I will not allow this mockery, to continue. But the words tasted bitter in his mouth. Retreat. He had never retreated before, and he would not do so now. Not without a fight. His pride would not allow it. But as he watched his fleet begin to shift and pull back, his chest tightened with a feeling of impending doom. It was too late for them. The humans had already learned how to disrupt his fleet's formation, how to strike where it hurt the most. And now, the remaining ships were scattered, vulnerable. One of the largest command vessels, the Zalkoth, was flanked on both sides by human ships. Their lasers seared through the dark expanse of space, taking out key systems on the ship. Talter could see the glow of the Zalkoth's engines faltering. Within moments, it would be gone. "Commander, the Zalkoth is..." Before Zikrin could finish, a deafening explosion ripped through the space above them. The Zalkoth was gone, shattered into 1,000 pieces. The human ships had struck again, their precision perfect, and now one of Talter's pride and joy was nothing but debris. "Enough," Talter roared, rising from his chair. He was losing his grip on his emotions, but he didn't care. His mind was a whirlwind of rage and disbelief. How had this happened? How could something as insignificant as a human fleet manage to outthink him, outfight him? Zikrin stepped back, his face pale. "Commander, our fleet is collapsing. The remaining ships are in full retreat. If we don't do something..." Talter whirled on him, cutting him off. "What more can we do?" He spat, his voice a harsh growl. "The humans have already broken our lines. We're not fighting them anymore. We're running for our lives." Zikrin flinched at his tone but pushed forward. "We may still have one chance, Commander. If we can regroup the last of the fleet, concentrate fire on the remaining human ships, we might be able to..." "We might be able to what?" Talter sneered. "Destroy a handful of their ships. It's already too late for that. They've outsmarted us at every turn. We're out of time." A cold silence filled the command room. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even Zikrin seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere, the inevitable loss. Then, unexpectedly, a new signal flared on Talter's console. A high-priority alert flashed, the warning blaring across the room. "Commander," Zikrin's voice was tinged with hope. "It's a transmission from the fleet's last remaining warship, the Jareth." Talter glanced at the screen. He recognized the Jareth, a powerful warship, equipped with the latest in alien weaponry. It was the last vessel in his fleet with any real combat capability. If there was any hope of survival, it lay with the Jareth. "Patch it through," Talter commanded, his voice suddenly quieter, more focused. The screen flickered, and a face appeared. A human face, a human officer. Talter's eyes narrowed in confusion. It was rare to see a human commander, and rarer still for them to contact the enemy directly. "This is Captain Laura of the Jareth." The woman's voice rang through the room, calm but laced with authority. "We have engaged the last remnants of your fleet, Talter, and we've secured your surrender." Talter's eyes burned with fury. "What did you say?" he hissed. "You think you've won. You think you can force my surrender. I'll make sure you regret this." But the human captain cut him off, her voice cold as ice. "You've lost, Talter. Your fleet is in ruins. The remaining ships are surrounded, and there's nowhere left for you to go. You will not escape." Talter's jaw clenched, the weight of her words hitting harder than any weapon. "We will never surrender," he growled. There was a long pause, and then Captain Laura spoke again, her voice almost pitying. "You don't have a choice. You're out of time. We know your tactics, Talter. We know you better than you know yourself. You've been outmaneuvered. It's over." The words echoed in his mind like a death knell, and for a fleeting moment, doubt crept in. Was it really over? Had the humans truly bested him? His fleet, his entire career, his pride, all of it was collapsing. And now, here he was, facing the crushing truth that the humans, with their flawed, ragtag fleet, had done what no one else could. They had defeated him. Captain Laura's voice broke through his thoughts again, this time with a finality that made his blood run cold. "You can either face your defeat with dignity, or we can finish this the hard way. The choice is yours." For the first time in his life, Talter didn't know how to answer. The command room was silent except for the hum of the consoles, and in that silence, he realized something he hadn't fully grasped until now. He had underestimated the humans. It was no longer just a battle. It was a war, and the humans had just turned the tide. He had been wrong, and there was no way to take that back. Talter stood at the command center of his flagship, the last remnants of his fleet scattered across the vastness of space. The hum of the dying warships echoed through the cold metal halls, their lights flickering as they slowly lost power. His mind raced, replaying the events that had brought him to this point. He had been so certain of victory, so confident in his tactics, and yet here he was, watching his empire crumble under the weight of his own hubris. "Commander," Zychron's voice interrupted his thoughts. "The Jareth is moving in. They're preparing to board us." The words struck like a hammer. Talter had known it was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud made the reality of it all too real. His fleet was no more. The Jareth, the human flagship, had wiped out his forces with terrifying precision. The idea of being boarded, captured by these same humans who had once been a joke to him, was almost too much to bear. "Deploy all remaining troops," Talter commanded, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Prepare for the worst. We will fight until the end." His orders were followed without question. The bridge bustled with the frantic energy of crew members preparing for a final stand. But even as they scrambled to ready themselves, Talter knew it was futile. There was no escaping this. The humans had outmaneuvered him at every turn, and now their victory was complete. Zychron approached, his expression grim. "We are vastly outnumbered, Commander. The Jareth is already deploying boarding pods. We don't have much time." Talter's eyes flicked to the view screen, where the human ships, sleek and efficient, were closing in. Their design was simple yet effective, and Talter found himself grudgingly impressed. He had never believed humans were capable of such advanced technology, but here they were, proving him wrong at every turn. "We fight to the last," Talter growled, trying to convince himself as much as his crew. "We show them that even in defeat, we are worthy of respect." But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no honor in this fight. His fleet had already been broken, and now the humans were coming for him. The sound of an explosion shook the ship, rattling Talter's teeth. The ship groaned, its internal systems straining as the first of the human boarding pods crashed into the hull. The ship's alarms blared, and the crew began to scramble, preparing for the inevitable breach. Talter gripped the armrests of his chair, his claws digging into the cold metal. He could feel the weight of failure crushing down on him. All his years of planning, all his years of conquest, had led to this moment, a moment where he would be nothing more than another prisoner in the hands of the humans. "Captain," Zychron called out urgently. "They're through the outer hull. The boarding teams are coming for us." Talter's mind raced, but there was nothing left to do. His ships were beyond saving, and there was no escape. He had been wrong to underestimate the humans. He had thought their strategy was primitive, but now he realized they had been playing a game of chess, while he had been blindly charging ahead, thinking only of brute force. "Seal the inner chambers," Talter ordered, though his words felt hollow. "We'll make our last stand in the command center." But as he turned to face the doorway, something caught his eye on the view screen. The lone human ship, a small, unassuming vessel, was approaching. Its weapons were offline, its shields lowered. It was a peaceful gesture, one that had no place in the chaos of battle. The human ship sent out a communication signal, and the face of Captain Laura appeared once more on the screen. "Commander Talter," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You've lost. Your fleet is destroyed, your forces scattered. There is no honor in fighting a losing battle. Surrender, and we will offer you a fair treatment." Talter stood frozen, the weight of her words sinking in. There it was, the final blow. He had lost everything. His pride, his fleet, his honor, all gone in an instant. The realization was almost suffocating. But despite it all, a small part of him wanted to fight on. He had never been one to surrender, not when he was so close to victory, not when he had seen the power of his forces crush entire civilizations. The humans had taken everything from him, but would he really allow them to take his dignity as well? "Never," he snarled, his voice thick with defiance. "I will not surrender to you." Captain Laura didn't seem surprised. In fact, there was a faint trace of pity in her expression as she responded. "You misunderstand, Talter. This is not about surrendering to us. It's about you realizing that your war is over. You fought well, better than we expected. But now, we're offering you something more than just death. You fought for your empire, for your people. We respect that." The words hung in the air like a strange kind of promise. Talter was still confused. "Respect. From the humans, we offer you a chance to live," Laura continued. "To rebuild. To find a place in the galaxy where your people can survive, if you choose to lay down your arms." Talter's chest tightened. He could hear the echo of his fallen comrades, the cries of his soldiers as they were wiped from existence. To survive. To rebuild. Could he really allow his people to live under the yoke of the humans? Could he allow his legacy to be reduced to mere survival? The human captain's eyes softened. "It's not about submission. It's about understanding that there are greater forces at work in this galaxy. You can learn from us, Talter. You can rise again." The words felt like poison, but deep down, Talter knew they were true. His empire had been brought low, but he was not a fool. Perhaps this was the beginning of something new, something unexpected. He had lost the battle. But did that mean he had to lose everything? Talter's fists clenched at his sides. He had been humiliated, but in this moment, he saw something that had never been possible before. A chance, a choice. "You have one chance, human," Talter said, his voice steady despite the rage still burning within him. "But if you betray me, if you take away what little honor I have left." "I won't betray you, Talter," Captain Laura interrupted softly. "But the decision is yours. Surrender now, and the galaxy will remember your people as survivors, not conquerors." Talter stood silently, staring into her eyes. This was it. The end of an era, the end of a dream. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was the beginning of something else entirely. "Prepare the boarding party," Talter said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. "But know this, if you lie to me, if you trick me, I will return. And the next time we meet, it will not be for peace." As the human ship approached, Talter knew that his fate was sealed. The war was over, but the story of Talter and his people was far from finished. They would rebuild, and they would rise again, on their own terms. Talter sat in his command chair, his mind swirling with confusion and rage. The once proud fleet he had led was now in tatters, scattered across the galaxy, destroyed by the very people he had underestimated, humans. His claws twitched as his fingers gripped the armrests, the tension in his muscles palpable. A sense of shame gnawed at him, but deeper still, something stirred, something darker. Anger, perhaps, or maybe a realization that, despite his defeat, he had been given a second chance. The screen before him flickered, and the face of Captain Laura appeared once more. This time, however, her demeanor was not one of victory or triumph, but something much more human, understanding. She was sitting in what appeared to be a simple command chair, dressed in a plain uniform, as if her role as a leader had become part of her very being. "Talter," she began, her voice calm, even compassionate. "I know this is hard. You've been through a lot, but we're not here to break you, not to destroy you. We're offering you a chance to join us, to rebuild what was lost." Talter's mind raced. Join them? After everything that had happened, could he really accept the offer of these humans who had obliterated his fleet, who had humiliated him in the face of his soldiers? His pride, his very identity as a tactician, had been crushed. What was left? "I don't understand," he said, his voice hoarse, betraying the weariness of his spirit. "You've destroyed my fleet." Talter's gaze flickered to the window, where the cold blackness of space stretched infinitely. He had always been a conqueror, a strategist who believed in the strength of his fleet, his tactics, and his people. To be reduced to this, sitting before a human, humiliated, with nothing left to his name, felt like a death sentence in itself. He could almost hear the voices of his fallen comrades, their screams echoing in his mind. The thought of abandoning them, of surrendering to these humans, was anathema to everything he had ever known. He let out a bitter laugh, but it was devoid of humor. You think I will forget all of this? You think I will turn the other cheek? I am Talter, and I do not bow. Not to you. Not to anyone. Laura's eyes darkened slightly, but she didn't flinch. I don't expect you to bow, Talter. But we are offering you a choice. You can continue your war, fight a losing battle that will only result in more destruction for your people, or you can accept our help. The galaxy is a vast place, and there's room for both of us to thrive. If you're willing to change, you're not the only one who's been humbled by war. Talter's chest tightened. Her words were not empty, and though his pride screamed against it, a part of him, the part that had always been a strategist, recognized the truth in what she said. The universe was vast, and to continue this senseless war would lead only to more death, more destruction, more humiliation. What was left to fight for? His empire was shattered, his people scattered, lost. Was there really any value in clinging to this hollow idea of conquest? He looked back at Laura, his features hard, his expression cold. And what do you want in return, human? What is it that you seek from me? You offer me mercy, but I have no reason to trust you. We seek nothing from you, Talter,